Eleanor Maddox was 74 years old when her granddaughter found her living in a 10 by 15 storage unit on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, surrounded by the furniture from a house she lived in for 41 years. She was sitting in her husband's old recliner, a quilt she'd sewn herself draped across her lap, reading a water-damaged paperback by the glow of a battery-powered lantern. She looked up when the metal door rattled open, and for 7 long seconds, neither woman spoke. Sarah expected to find boxes. She expected dust and old photographs, and maybe some furniture her father had been too lazy to sell. What she didn't expect was her grandmother, thin, gray, and very much alive, looking at her with an expression that wasn't shock or relief or even recognition at first, but something closer to resignation. The way a person looks when a secret they've been keeping for 3 years finally walks through the door and stares them in the face. Eleanor closed the book, set it on the plastic crate beside her chair, and said in a voice that had gone rusty from disuse, "I was wondering when one of you would come." To understand how Eleanor Maddox ended up in that storage unit, you need to understand what she'd built before it was taken from her, and what she'd given up for the 4 sons who decided she was no longer worth keeping. She was born Eleanor Ruth Simmons in 1949, the third of 5 children in a family that had more love than money and more faith than either. Her father worked at the paper mill on Route 9, came home every night with ink under his fingernails and sawdust in his hair, and never once complained about the work because the work meant his children ate. Her mother stretched every dollar until it begged for mercy, made soup from bones, clothes from scraps, and somehow kept 5 children fed and dressed and believing they were rich when they were anything but. Eleanor learned early that love was not something you said, it was something you did. It was waking up at 4 a.m. to pack lunches. It was sewing patches onto patches. It was showing up every single day, even when you were tired, even when you were sick, even when no one noticed. That was the inheritance Eleanor carried into her marriage to Henry Maddox. Not money, not property, but the bone-deep understanding that family was built through sacrifice, through presence, through the accumulation of small daily choices that nobody ever thanked you for. Henry was a machinist at the automotive plant 22 miles outside of town. They met at a church picnic in the summer of 1968, married 14 months later, and bought the house on Maple Street in 1972 with a down payment they'd scraped together from 3 years of saving. The house was modest. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with yellow linoleum that Eleanor hated but never replaced, because replacing it would mean money that could go towards something more important. A backyard with a fence Henry built himself, and a garden where Eleanor grew tomatoes and zucchini and green beans that she canned every August. They had their first son, Daniel, in 1973. Robert came in 1975, Michael in 1977, and Thomas, the baby, the unexpected one, the one Eleanor always said was her gift from God because she thought she was done, in 1980. 4 boys in 7 years. 4 sons who grew up in that house on Maple Street, who learned to ride bikes on that cracked sidewalk, who fought and laughed and broke things and were forgiven, who sat at that kitchen table every night and ate the food their mother cooked, and never once thought to wonder how much of herself she was putting on those plates. Eleanor was not a perfect mother. She would be the first to tell you that if you asked. She lost her temper sometimes. She cried in the bathroom when the boys couldn't hear. She went to bed exhausted more nights than she could count, and woke up exhausted every morning, and did it all again because that was what you did. You showed up. You kept going. You did the work even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching, because the work was the point. The work was the love. Henry was a good man, quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed things instead of complaining about them, and who showed affection through action rather than words. He came home every night. He coached Little League. He built a treehouse in the backyard that all 4 boys used until they outgrew it. And then he built a basketball hoop. And then he taught them all to drive in the parking lot behind the Methodist church. He and Eleanor didn't have a dramatic love story. They had something better. They had 28 years of showing up for each other, of building something together, of weathering the hard seasons and appreciating the good ones. They had a marriage that worked because both of them worked at it, every single day. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March of 2001, Henry Maddox had a heart attack at the plant and died before the ambulance arrived. He was 56 years old. Eleanor was 52. Daniel was 28, Robert was 26, Michael was 24, and Thomas was 21, and still living at home, still trying to figure out what he wanted to be. The funeral was on a Friday. It rained. The church was full of people who said kind things that Eleanor wouldn't remember later, and afterward everyone came back to the house on Maple Street and ate casseroles and stood around looking uncomfortable, because death makes everyone uncomfortable, even the people who mean well. By Sunday, the visitors were gone. Monday morning, Eleanor woke up alone in a bed that was suddenly too big, in a house that was suddenly too quiet, and realized that the life she had built, the partnership, the routine, the shared purpose, was over. She was 52 years old, her husband was dead, and she had 4 sons who still needed her, whether they knew it or not. What Eleanor did next is important, because later, when the sons were making their excuses, when they were telling themselves and each other that she'd brought this on herself, when they were rewriting history to justify what they'd done, what she did next was the thing they conveniently forgot. She didn't fall apart. She didn't give up. She didn't ask anyone to rescue her. She got up every morning and figured out how to survive without the person she'd planned to spend the rest of her life with. Henry had life insurance, not much, but enough to pay off the mortgage. The house on Maple Street was hers, free and clear. She had his pension, which wasn't large, but was steady. She had Social Security, and she had, for the first time in 28 years, no one depending on her. Thomas was the last to leave, moving out 6 months after the funeral to take a job in Columbus. Eleanor stood at the front door and watched him drive away in a car she'd helped him buy, and she felt something she hadn't expected: relief. Not because she didn't love her son. She loved all her sons with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her, but because, for the first time since 1973, she could stop, she could rest, she could finally take care of herself the way she'd spent 3 decades taking care of everyone else. She joined a book club at the library. She volunteered at the church's food pantry every Wednesday. She started walking 3 miles every morning, rain or shine. Same because the doctor said it was good for her heart, and because she liked the way the neighborhood looked at 6 a.m., quiet and peaceful, the houses still sleeping. She called each of her sons once a week. Daniel, who had moved to Chicago and become an accountant and married a woman named Valerie who never seemed to have time to talk. Robert, who lived 40 minutes away in Springfield and worked in insurance and had 2 children Eleanor adored but rarely saw. Michael, who had gone to California and done something with computers that Eleanor never fully understood and who always sounded distracted when she called, like he was doing something more important while pretending to listen. And Thomas, her baby, who was only an hour away in Columbus, but who might as well have been on the moon for how often he visited. Though he'd married a woman named Denise, who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes, and they had a daughter, Sarah, who was the one bright spot in every phone call, the one person who actually seemed happy to talk to Grandma. For years, this was enough. Eleanor didn't ask for much. A phone call, a birthday card, maybe a visit at Christmas, though even that became unreliable as the boys got busy with their own families, their own lives, their own priorities that somehow never seemed to include a 2-hour drive to see their mother. She understood. She told herself she understood. Children grow up, they move on, they build their own lives, and that was the point, wasn't it? That was what you raised them for, not to keep them tethered to you forever, but to give them wings and let them fly. She just hadn't expected them to fly quite so far, or to stop looking back. The first real sign of trouble came in 2015. Eleanor was 66 years old. She'd been a widow for 14 years. She'd managed just fine on her own, thank you very much. The house was paid off. Her expenses were low. She had Henry's pension and her Social Security and a small savings account she added to every month, just in case. She wasn't rich, but she was comfortable. She had what she needed. Then Daniel called. Her eldest son, the one she'd always thought of as the responsible one, the one who'd taken charge when his father died and handled the paperwork and made sure everything was in order. He never called on a Thursday. She knew before she answered that something was wrong. He said he was in trouble. He said the word bankruptcy like it was a disease, meant something shameful that had happened to him rather than something he'd chosen. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man who was not used to asking for help and resented having to do it now. He didn't say how much he needed. He said what he needed it for, to save the house, the cars, the life he and Valerie had built in the suburbs of Chicago. He said he would pay her back. He said it was just temporary. Eleanor had $47,000 in her savings account. It was everything she had beyond the house itself. Every birthday she'd skipped buying herself a present. Every vacation she'd never taken. Every small sacrifice she'd made over 14 years of widowhood, tucked away for emergencies, for medical bills, for a rainy day she hoped would never come. She gave him $40,000. She kept $7,000 because she wasn't stupid. Because even a mother who loved her son knew better than to leave herself with nothing. Daniel said thank you. He said he'd pay her back within 2 years. He said he was grateful, so grateful, and Eleanor believed him because she needed to believe him, because the alternative was believing that her son, the boy she'd nursed through chickenpox, taught to tie his shoes, watched graduate from college, was the kind of man who would take his mother's life savings and forget the promise before he hung up the phone. He never paid her back. Not in 2 years, not in 5, not ever. When she called to ask about it, gently at first, then more directly, there was always a reason. Still recovering. Valerie's medical expenses, the kids' college funds. Life is expensive, Mom. You don't understand how expensive everything is now. He stopped calling on Sundays. She started calling him, and he'd pick up every third time, every fourth time, his voice clipped and impatient, like she was a bill collector rather than the woman who'd given him life. She stopped asking about the money. She couldn't afford to lose both the money and the relationship, but the relationship was already gone. She just didn't know it yet. Robert was next. Her second son, the one who lived closest, the one she saw most often, which was still only 3 or 4 times a year, but that was more than the others. He came to her in 2017 with a business opportunity. He said those words like they meant something, like opportunity was a guarantee rather than a gamble. He needed $15,000. He'd double her money in 6 months. Eleanor didn't have $15,000. She had $7,000 in savings, and the house. Robert said the house was the point. She didn't need all that space. 3 bedrooms for 1 person? It didn't make sense. The market was good. She could sell, buy a nice little condo, have money left over for herself and money to invest with him. She said no. She said the house was her home. She said she'd raised 4 boys there, buried her husband from there, planted a garden there that still grew tomatoes every summer. She said, no, Robert, I'm not selling my house. He didn't yell. He was never the type to yell. He just got quiet, cold. The visits became less frequent, the phone calls shorter. When she saw him at Christmas that year, he barely looked at her, and Denise, Thomas's wife, not Robert's, but they were friends. The daughters-in-law, they talked. Mentioned something about Eleanor being selfish. Selfish. The word hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor said nothing, but she remembered. Michael never asked for money directly. Her third son, the one in California, the one who'd done well for himself in ways Eleanor didn't entirely understand. He made 6 figures. He had a house in a suburb of San Jose that was worth more than Eleanor's entire street. He didn't need her money. What he needed was to stop feeling guilty about never visiting, so he stopped calling. If you don't call, you don't have to explain why you never come home. If you don't call, you don't have to hear your mother's voice getting older, slower, more fragile with each passing year. If you don't call, you can pretend that she's fine, that the distance is mutual, that everyone's just busy and that's normal. That's how adult children and their parents work. Everyone knows that. Michael went 8 months without calling in 2018. When Eleanor finally reached him, he sounded surprised to hear her voice, like he'd forgotten she existed. Like she was a character from a story he'd read a long time ago, rather than the woman who'd changed his diapers and sat up with him through nightmares and saved for years to help pay for the college that got him to California in the first place. She didn't yell. She never yelled. She just said, "I miss you, Michael." And he said, "I know, Mom. I'll try to call more," and they both knew he was lying, and that was somehow worse than if he'd just admitted the truth. Thomas was the one who finally broke her youngest son, her baby, the one she'd always been closest to, or thought she was, and the one whose daughter, Sarah, was the only grandchild who'd ever really seemed to see her as a person rather than an obligation. Thomas had struggled in ways the other boys hadn't. He'd bounced between jobs in his 20s. His marriage to Denise was rocky from the start. Eleanor had never said anything, would never say anything, but she'd seen the way Denise looked at Thomas when she thought no one was watching, the contempt barely hidden beneath the surface. And Sarah, their daughter, was caught in the middle of it all, a girl who was too smart and too sensitive for the family she'd been born into. By 2019, Eleanor was 70 years old. She'd been living alone for 18 years. Her savings had never recovered from Daniel's loan. She got by on Social Security and the small pension that arrived like clockwork on the first of every month. But there wasn't much left over. The house needed repairs. The roof was 30 years old. The furnace made sounds that worried her. She'd started to wonder quietly to herself in the hours before sleep what would happen when she couldn't manage on her own anymore. That's when Thomas came to her with a plan. He said he'd been talking to his brothers, all four of them together, which hadn't happened since their father's funeral. He said they were worried about her. He said they wanted to help. He said they'd found a place for her, a beautiful assisted living community outside of Columbus, close to him and Denise and Sarah. She'd have her own apartment. She'd have meals prepared for her, activities, other people her age to talk to. She'd be safe. She'd be taken care of. All she had to do was sell the house. She had the house she'd lived in for 47 years. The house where she'd raised her children and buried her husband. The house with Henry's basketball hoop still standing in the driveway, and her tomato garden still growing in the backyard, and the door frame in the kitchen, where she'd marked the boys' heights every birthday, pencil marks that climbed like ladders, proof that her children had once been small enough to need her. Thomas said it was the smart thing to do. The market was good. The house was worth more than it had ever been. She'd have money left over after paying for the assisted living, money that could go to her grandchildren, to her own care, to whatever she wanted. She didn't have to decide right away. Just think about it, Mom. We just want what's best for you. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about it for 3 months, which felt like 3 years. She walked through every room of that house and remembered what had happened there. The kitchen where she'd cooked 10,000 meals, the living room where Henry had proposed on one knee in front of the Christmas tree, a ring he'd saved 6 months to buy. The bedroom where she'd given birth to Thomas. He'd come too fast, no time to get to the hospital, and the paramedics had arrived just in time to cut the cord while Eleanor held her bloody, screaming, perfect son against her chest and cried with joy. She didn't want to leave, but she was 70 years old, and the roof really did need replacing, and the furnace really was making sounds that worried her, and her sons were finally paying attention to her, talking to her, acting like they cared about her future. Maybe this was what she needed. Maybe this was the sacrifice she needed to make to get her family back. She signed the papers in April of 2020. Thomas handled everything, the listing, the showings, the sale. The house sold for $187,000. Not as much as Thomas had predicted, but the market had shifted, he said. The pandemic had changed things. She had to be realistic. There were fees, closing costs, a real estate commission. By the time everything was settled, Eleanor had $143,000 left. Thomas said he'd hold it for her. He said it would be simpler that way, easier to manage, less paperwork for the assisted living facility. She could access it whenever she needed it. He'd set up an account. She just needed to sign one more form. Eleanor signed, and then she packed her entire life into boxes, said goodbye to the only home she'd ever known, and let her youngest son drive her to her new life. Except there was no assisted living facility. There was no beautiful apartment with prepared meals and activities and other people her age. What there was a storage unit, Unit 247 at Crossroads Self-Storage, 14 miles outside of Dayton, Ohio. A 10 by 15 metal box with a rolling door and a concrete floor, and no heat, no water, no bathroom, no windows. Thomas helped her unload the furniture. The recliner that had been Henry's, the couch, the kitchen table where she'd fed her family for 40 years. He stacked the boxes against the walls. He said this was temporary. He said the assisted living facility was full. There was a waiting list. It would only be a few weeks. He gave her a sleeping bag for the cold nights, a battery-powered lantern, a cooler with food that would last 5 days, a bucket. She understood what the bucket was for. She didn't say anything. Her son kissed her on the forehead and said he'd be back soon and drove away in the car that her money had helped pay for, toward a life that her sacrifice had made possible. That was the last time Eleanor saw any of her sons. That was November of 2020. She didn't know it yet, but she would live in that storage unit for 3 years, 2 months and 17 days. She survived because she was Eleanor Maddox, and Eleanor Maddox did not give up. That first night, she didn't sleep. She sat in Henry's recliner with the quilt she'd sewn 20 years ago wrapped around her shoulders and listened to the sounds of the storage facility, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, the occasional car passing on the road outside, the skittering of mice in the units nearby. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself Thomas would come back. She told herself there had been a mistake, a miscommunication, something that could be fixed with a phone call and a conversation. The next morning, she tried to call. Thomas's number went straight to voicemail. Daniel's number went straight to voicemail. Robert's number had been disconnected. Michael's phone rang and rang and rang and no one answered. She called every day for 2 weeks. She left messages. She texted. She sent emails from the library computer when she could get there, a 45-minute walk each way along roads with no sidewalks. Nothing. No response. No explanation. Nothing but silence from the 4 sons she had raised and loved and sacrificed for. By December, she understood. She wasn't waiting for a facility. She wasn't on a list. She had been discarded. Her house had been sold. Her money had been taken, and she had been placed somewhere her sons would never have to see her, never have to think about her, never have to explain to their wives or their children or their friends why their mother was no longer part of their lives. She was 71 years old. She had no money, no home, and no family. And she had 2 choices. She could give up, or she could survive. Eleanor Maddox did not give up. She learned the rhythms of the storage facility. The manager, a man in his 50s named Carl, who had a bad hip and a worse attitude, came by twice a day, once at 8 a.m., once at 6 p.m., to check the locks and make sure no one was doing anything they shouldn't be doing. She learned to be invisible during those times, to sit quiet in the recliner with the lantern off, Fosse barely breathing until his footsteps faded down the corridor. The storage facility had a bathroom in the main office that was technically for employees only, but the night manager, a younger woman named Rosa who worked the desk from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., let Eleanor use it after hours. Rosa never asked questions. She just left the side door unlocked and looked the other way, and sometimes she left a sandwich or a bottle of water on the counter where Eleanor would find it. Eleanor never asked her name for 6 months. She was afraid that knowing too much would make Rosa vulnerable, would give her a reason to stop helping. But one night, when Eleanor came in shivering from the January cold, her fingers so numb she could barely turn the faucet, Rosa wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and said, "My mother lived in a car for a year before she got back on her feet. You're not the first person to fall through the cracks, and you won't be the last." That's when Eleanor learned her name. That's when Eleanor started calling her Mija, the way her own mother had called her daughters, and Rosa started calling Eleanor Mama Ellie, and something like friendship, something like family, began to grow in that bleak concrete building where people stored the things they didn't want to think about. The winters were the hardest. The storage unit had no heat. Eleanor layered every blanket she owned on top of herself at night and still woke up with aching joints and chattering teeth. She got a respiratory infection in February of 2021 that lasted 6 weeks and left her coughing blood into tissues she hid at the bottom of garbage bags so Rosa wouldn't see. She thought she might die that winter. She thought about what would happen if she did, who would find her, how long it would take, whether her sons would even come to claim the body. She didn't die. She got up every morning. She walked to the library and used the computers and looked for help. Shelters, social services, anything that might get her out of that unit and into something safer. But every program had requirements she couldn't meet. You needed an address. You needed ID. You needed documents that proved you were who you said you were, and all of Eleanor's documents were in Thomas's possession, in a folder he'd told her he was keeping safe for her. She was 71 years old. She had no birth certificate, no social security card, no proof that she had ever existed. She was a ghost. By the second year, she had created a routine. She woke at 5 a.m. before Carl's morning rounds. She walked to the truck stop 2 miles away, where she could buy coffee for $1.50 and sit in a booth for 3 hours without anyone bothering her. She ate 1 meal a day, whatever she could afford, which wasn't much, because her social security checks were still being deposited into an account Thomas controlled, an account she had no access to. $63 a day, that's what she was entitled to. She never saw a penny of it. Sometimes she found work. Day labor under the table, the kind of work no one wanted to do. Cleaning out foreclosed houses. sorting donations at the Goodwill that didn't ask too many questions, watching children for a few hours while their mothers worked shifts at the factories that dotted the highway. She was 72 years old, then 73, then 74, and she was working harder than she had ever worked in her life just to afford food and the $89 a month she paid to keep the storage unit, the $89 that came from the cash she earned, and the cash Rosa sometimes slipped her, and the change she found on the ground outside the truck stop. Every penny counted, every penny hoarded, because if she lost the unit, she would lose the last of her furniture, the last physical proof that she had ever had a life before this. She kept Henry's recliner centered in the unit, like an altar. She kept the quilt she'd sewn on top of it, save the one with squares cut from her son's childhood clothes, Daniel's striped shirt from first grade, Robert's baseball jersey, Michael's Halloween costume from the year he was a pirate, Thomas's baby blanket. She kept a photograph of her wedding day in a frame on the plastic crate beside the chair. She kept a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and every night before she fell asleep, she read a verse out loud to the empty room, the way her father had read verses to his children every night before bed, the way she had read verses to her sons before they grew old enough to roll their eyes and call it boring. She prayed, not for rescue, not for her sons to come back. She prayed for strength. She prayed for tomorrow. She prayed that God would help her understand why this had happened, what she had done wrong, what lesson she was supposed to be learning from all of this. She never got an answer, but the praying helped. It reminded her that she was still alive, that she was still Eleanor, that she was still a person, even if the world had forgotten. Now, Sarah, the granddaughter, the one who actually came. Sarah was 24 years old when she found her grandmother. She was Thomas's daughter, the only child from his marriage to Denise, which had finally collapsed in 2019 after 18 years of mutual resentment and one affair that Denise never admitted to, but never convincingly denied. Sarah had been 19 when her parents divorced. She'd watched her father move out, watched her mother turn bitter and mean, watched her own childhood rewritten by two people who couldn't agree on what had happened or whose fault it was. She'd gone to college in Cincinnati, and then taken a job at a nonprofit in Columbus, the kind of job that paid barely enough to live on, but made her feel like she was doing something that mattered. She hadn't spoken to her father in 2 years. Their last conversation had been a fight about money. Thomas had asked her to co-sign a loan, and when she'd said no, he'd accused her of being selfish, of not caring about family, of turning into her mother. She'd hung up on him and blocked his number and told herself she was better off without him. But she thought about her grandmother. She thought about Grandma Ellie, who had always listened, who had always remembered birthdays, who had always made her feel like she mattered, even when her parents were too busy screaming at each other to notice she was in the room. Why, she thought about the last time she'd seen her grandmother, Christmas of 2019, at the house on Maple Street, before the pandemic, before the sale. Grandma Ellie had pulled her aside in the kitchen and pressed something into her hand, a $50 bill folded into a square. For emergencies, she'd said, don't tell your father. Sarah had never spent that $50. She'd kept it in her wallet, tucked behind her driver's license, a reminder that someone in her family actually cared about her. In October of 2023, Sarah decided to reach out to her grandmother. She'd been thinking about it for months, the guilt building like pressure behind a dam. 3 years since she'd heard her grandmother's voice. 3 years of assuming everything was fine because no one had told her otherwise. She called her father's number, still blocked. She unblocked it, and called again, straight to voicemail. She called her Uncle Robert. A recording said the number was no longer in service. She called her Uncle Daniel. The number rang twice, and then Valerie's voice, clipped, annoyed, said, "What do you want, Sarah?" Sarah asked about her grandmother. There was a pause, a long pause. Then Valerie said, "Eleanor is fine. She's in a facility near your father. You'd have to ask him about it." "What facility? What's it called?" "I don't know. You'll have to ask Thomas." And then Valerie hung up. Sarah sat in her apartment in Columbus and stared at her phone and felt something cold settle in her chest. Something was wrong. She didn't know what, but she knew, in her bones, in her gut, that something was very, very wrong. She started digging. She searched for Eleanor Maddox in every assisted living facility within 50 miles of Columbus. No record. She searched senior care centers, nursing homes, memory care units. No record anywhere. She searched public records for the house on Maple Street and found that it had been sold in 2020 to a family from Toledo. She searched her grandmother's name in every database she could think of, and what she found was a woman who had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. No address, no phone, no credit activity, no utility bills, no medical records, nothing. It was like Eleanor Maddox had simply vanished from the world. For 2 weeks, Sarah barely slept. She called every family member she could think of, distant cousins, her grandmother's old friends from church, anyone who might know something. No one knew where Eleanor was. Some people hadn't heard from her in years. Some people assumed she was dead. One woman, a member of Eleanor's old book club, said she'd tried to reach her in 2021 and the number had been disconnected. "I figured she'd passed," the woman said. "No one told me otherwise." Sarah finally found the answer by accident. She was going through her father's old emails. She still had access to an account he'd forgotten to change the password on, a relic from when she was a teenager, and he'd made her responsible for managing his calendar. And she found a chain of messages between Thomas, Daniel, Robert, and Michael. The subject line was Mom's Stuff. The messages were from November 2020. They discussed the sale of the house. They discussed the money. $143,000 split 4 ways, $35,750 each. So they discussed what to do with the furniture and the belongings that weren't worth selling. "Storage unit," Daniel had written. "There's a place off Route 4 that charges $89 a month. Thomas can handle it." And then a message from Thomas. "Done," she settled. "Let's not discuss this again." Sarah read that word, settled, and something inside her cracked open. She drove to Crossroads Self-Storage on a Thursday afternoon in November, 3 years and 2 weeks after her grandmother had been left there. She told the manager, Carl, that she was looking for her grandmother's belongings. She said Eleanor Maddox. She said she was family. Carl's face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or relief. He said, "Unit 247. He said, your grandmother's there now." He said it like it was nothing. Say like Eleanor Maddox was just another piece of furniture stored and forgotten. Sarah walked down the corridor. The air smelled like dust and mildew and something else, something organic, something that made her stomach turn. She stopped in front of Unit 247. The rolling door was closed, but not locked. She pulled it up, and there was her grandmother, sitting in the same recliner Sarah remembered from childhood, wrapped in the same quilt that Sarah used to curl up under when she spent the night at Grandma's house, reading a book by the light of a battery-powered lantern. Eleanor looked up. For 7 seconds, neither woman spoke. What happened next was messy and loud and full of the kind of crying that comes from 3 years of holding everything inside and finally letting it out. Sarah fell to her knees on the concrete floor and wrapped her arms around her grandmother and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know." Eleanor held her. She stroked her granddaughter's hair the way she'd stroked it when Sarah was a little girl, before the world had gotten complicated, before everyone had grown up and moved away and forgotten what family was supposed to mean. She said, "It's not your fault." She said, "You're here now." She said, "That's what matters." They sat together in that storage unit for 2 hours before Sarah could bring herself to move. Eleanor told her everything. The money she'd given Daniel, the pressure from Robert, the silence from Michael, the betrayal by Thomas. The day she'd been dropped off at this unit with a sleeping bag and a bucket. The 3 years of survival, of invisibility, of praying for strength while the world went on without her. Sarah listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to make excuses for her father or her uncles. She just listened, and when Eleanor was finished, she said, "You're coming home with me tonight." And then she said, "And I'm going to make them pay for this." The first night, Eleanor slept in Sarah's bed while Sarah slept on the couch. Eleanor lay under clean sheets in a warm room and listened to the sounds of a real apartment. The refrigerator humming, the neighbor's TV through the wall, the distant rumble of traffic on the highway. And she cried. Not from sadness, not anymore. She cried from relief. She cried because she was warm and safe and not alone, and because her granddaughter had come for her, and because maybe, she had not been completely forgotten after all. Again, the next morning, Sarah made pancakes. Blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, Eleanor's favorite, and she didn't ask how Sarah knew. She just sat at the table in Sarah's kitchen and ate slowly, savoring every bite, because she hadn't had a real breakfast in 3 years, and because this small kindness, this normal, ordinary act of care, felt like the most precious thing in the world. They didn't talk about the brothers that first day. They talked about other things. Sarah's job, her apartment, the life she'd built for herself in the years since she'd left her parents' chaos behind. Eleanor talked about Rosa, about the truck stop, about the library where she'd spent so many hours pretending to be a normal person with somewhere to go. They talked like they were getting to know each other again, which in some ways they were. So much time had passed. So much had changed. But underneath all of it, underneath the years and the distance and the betrayal, they were still grandmother and granddaughter, still connected by something that could not be broken, no matter how hard anyone tried. After a week, Eleanor had color in her cheeks again. After 2 weeks, she was walking to the coffee shop on the corner every morning, just because she could, just because it felt good to walk somewhere and arrive somewhere and have someone smile and say, "Good morning." After a month, she had her own room in Sarah's apartment. The spare room that Sarah had been using as a home office, cleared out and painted and filled with furniture from the storage unit. The recliner, the quilt, the photograph of Henry, the Bible that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. Sarah had hired a lawyer. When that was the first thing she'd done after getting her grandmother settled, she'd found a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation, and she'd told him everything. The lawyer's name was Marcus Chen. He was 38 years old, the son of immigrants, and he had built his career on cases that other lawyers considered too small or too complicated or too emotionally messy to bother with. When Sarah finished telling him what her father and uncles had done, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This is one of the worst cases of family betrayal I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot." He said they could pursue criminal charges, theft, fraud, elder abuse. He said they could pursue civil damages. The house had been sold under false pretenses. The money had been taken without consent. But Eleanor's Social Security benefits had been intercepted for 3 years. He said it would be a long fight. The brothers would deny everything. They would blame each other. They would claim Eleanor was confused, or that she'd agreed to the arrangement, or that they were trying to help, and things had just gone wrong. They would make themselves the victims if they could. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And Eleanor, sitting in a chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, said, "I spent 3 years living in a storage unit because my sons decided I wasn't worth keeping. I don't want revenge. I want them to understand what they did. I want the truth on the record. And if the truth means they have to face consequences, then that's not revenge. That's justice." Marcus nodded. He said, "Then let's get started." And the first one they contacted was Thomas, Sarah's father, the one who had orchestrated the whole thing, the one who had driven his mother to the storage unit and left her there. He didn't respond to the lawyer's letter. He didn't respond to the second letter or the third. But when the police showed up at his door with a warrant for his arrest, he responded to that. He was booked on charges of theft, fraud, and criminal elder abuse. His mugshot showed a man who looked older than his 44 years, heavy around the middle, with eyes that were red from crying or drinking, or both. Sarah didn't feel sorry for him. She'd spent her whole life feeling sorry for him, for his failures, his excuses, his endless ability to blame everyone else for his own choices. That was over now. Daniel's arrest came 3 weeks later in Chicago. So he'd hired a lawyer immediately, an expensive one, and his defense was that he'd had no idea what Thomas was doing. He'd taken the money from the sale, yes, but he'd assumed his mother was being cared for. He'd assumed everything was legitimate. He was shocked to learn that she'd been living in a storage unit. The prosecutor didn't believe him, neither did the jury eventually. Robert had fled to Florida by the time the warrants were issued. They found him 6 months later living in a trailer park outside of Tampa, working under a fake name at a landscaping company. He'd spent his share of the money, all of it, on gambling and a failed business venture and a divorce settlement with his second wife. He had nothing left to take, but that didn't matter. The consequences weren't just about money. They were about accountability. They were about a 74-year-old woman who had spent 3 years in a concrete box because her sons had decided she was disposable. Michael was the only one who came forward voluntarily. He flew in from California 3 months after the case went public. It had made the news, a human interest story that went viral. The kind of story that made people cry and share and comment about how they would never treat their own mothers that way. He called Marcus's office and asked if he could meet with his mother. Eleanor said no. Sarah was with her when she made that decision. They were sitting in Eleanor's room, the evening light coming through the window, the quilt draped over Eleanor's lap. Sarah asked if she was sure. Eleanor said, "Michael didn't call me for 8 months before I was put in that unit. He never asked where I was. Mom, he never wondered what happened to me. He cashed his check and kept living his life, and now he wants forgiveness because it's convenient, because the cameras are watching, because he doesn't want to be the only brother who didn't even try." And then she said, "Forgiveness is for the one who forgives, not the one who's forgiven. And I'm not ready. I may never be ready. That's my choice to make." Sarah didn't argue. She understood. Forgiveness was not something you could force. It was not something you could rush. And Eleanor had earned the right to withhold it for as long as she wanted, or forever, if that was what she needed to do. The trials lasted 18 months. They were ugly and painful, and full of moments that made Eleanor wish she'd never started any of it. She had to sit in a courtroom and listen to her son's lawyers describe her as confused, manipulative, ungrateful. She had to listen to Valerie testify that Eleanor had always been difficult, always demanding, always wanting more than her children could give. She had to listen to Denise, Thomas's ex-wife, say that Eleanor had been showing signs of dementia for years, that the storage unit had been a temporary measure while they figured out the best care option, that no one had intended for her to stay there so long. The lies were almost worse than the original betrayal, because the original betrayal had been done in private, behind closed doors, where no one could see. But the lies were told in public, in a courtroom, under oath. Her sons looked her in the eye and lied about what they had done to her, but the evidence was too strong. On the emails, the bank records, the testimony from Rosa, who had kept a journal of every time she'd seen Eleanor at the storage facility, every time she'd left food or water, every time she'd worried that this old woman was going to die alone in a metal box, and no one would ever know. The testimony from Carl, who admitted he'd known something was wrong, but hadn't done anything because it wasn't his business. The testimony from Eleanor herself, calm and clear and utterly devastating, describing in exact detail what it was like to live for 3 years in a place meant for furniture, while your children spent your money and pretended you didn't exist. Thomas got 7 years, Daniel got 5, Robert got 4. Michael, who had cooperated and who could demonstrate that he had not been directly involved in the original scheme, only in accepting the money afterward without asking questions, got 2 years of probation and was ordered to pay restitution. The civil case was settled out of court. The brothers, or their assets, their retirement accounts, their wives' inheritances, paid a combined $312,000 in damages. It wasn't enough to undo what had been done. No amount of money could do that. But it was enough for Eleanor to live comfortably for whatever years she had left. It was enough for Sarah to buy a small house with a garden and a room for her grandmother and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. Eleanor was 77 years old when the last trial ended. She was tired. She was thinner than she'd ever been, and her hair had gone completely white, and there were days when her body reminded her that she'd spent 3 winters in an unheated storage unit, and her lungs and her bones had not forgiven her for it. But she was alive. She was free. She was surrounded by people who cared about her, Sarah, of course, and Rosa, who had moved to Columbus to be closer to them, and the neighbors who brought casseroles and asked Eleanor to join their book club, and the strangers who stopped her on the street sometimes because they'd seen her story on the news and wanted to tell her she was an inspiration. She didn't feel like an inspiration. She felt like a woman who had done what she had to do to survive, and who had been lucky enough to have a granddaughter who came looking for her. But if other people wanted to call that inspiration, she wasn't going to argue. On the first anniversary of her rescue, that's what Sarah called it, even though Eleanor said she hadn't been rescued, she'd been found, they drove back to the storage facility. It had closed 6 months earlier. The building was empty, the units abandoned, the for sale sign already fading in the Ohio weather. Eleanor stood in front of Unit 247 and looked at the rolled down door and tried to remember what it had felt like to live there. The cold, the fear, the smell of concrete and dust, the loneliness that had been so heavy she could feel it pressing on her chest like a physical weight. She couldn't quite access it anymore. The feelings were there, stored away like the belongings that had once filled that unit, but she couldn't feel them the way she had when she was living through them. That was probably a mercy. Sarah stood beside her, not saying anything, just being there. After a while, Eleanor took her granddaughter's hand and said, "I want you to know something." Sarah said, "What?" Eleanor said, "I never stopped believing someone would come. I didn't know who. I didn't know when. But I knew in my bones that I wasn't going to die in that place, that God had something else planned for me." And then she said, "I think the plan was you." They stood there for a while longer, the two of them, in the empty parking lot of a closed storage facility on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio. And then they drove home. If you're watching this right now, I want you to take something from this story, not just the horror of it, though the horror is real and it matters. Now, and it should make you angry because it happened to a real woman, and it happens to real people every day in this country. But the other part too, the part about the granddaughter who went looking, the part about the friend who left sandwiches and looked the other way, the part about the old woman in the recliner who refused to give up. There are people in your life right now who you haven't checked on in too long. Parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, neighbors who live alone, people who might be fine, or who might be invisible, or who might be sitting somewhere waiting for someone to remember that they exist. Call them, visit them, ask them how they're really doing, and then listen to the answer. Because the difference between Eleanor Maddox surviving and Eleanor Maddox dying alone in a storage unit was one person. One person who cared enough to ask questions, one person who didn't accept the easy answers, one person who showed up. You could be that person for someone. You might already be. And if you're the one who's been forgotten, if you're watching this and you see yourself in Eleanor, if you know what it feels like to be discarded by the people who are supposed to love you, I want you to know that your story isn't over. The world is full of people who will find you if you let them. People who will become your family, even if they weren't born into it. People who will see you, really see you, and refuse to look away. Eleanor Maddox spent 3 years in a storage unit, but that's not how her story ends. Her story ends with a garden and a porch and a granddaughter who makes blueberry pancakes on Sunday mornings. It ends with the sun going down over the Ohio hills and 2 women sitting side by side, not needing to say anything, just being together. That's how it ends, with warmth, with presence, with love. The real kind of love, the kind you do, not the kind you say. And that, after everything, was enough. Was